From a production nightmare that doubled its filming schedule to a tragic disaster that doomed its box office, SpaceCamp 1986 is cursed by history, yet celebrated by those it inspired. With Joaquin Phoenix's wooden Star Wars references, a legendary composer's rare score, and the eerie presence of a fallen astronaut still visible in the film's computer screens, this forgotten gem holds secrets stranger than its impossible premise. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about SpaceCamp. Fact 1. Challenger disaster turned marketing nightmare. SpaceCamp was supposed to be a lighthearted family adventure about kids accidentally launching themselves into space, but its release became one of the most unfortunate timing disasters in Hollywood history. The film was completed and ready for audiences in late 1985, with a planned release date of February 6, 1986. Then, on January 28, 1986, just 9 days before the scheduled premiere, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 crew members including teacher Krista McAuliffe. The entire nation watched in horror as the shuttle disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean. And suddenly, a movie about kids goofing around in space seemed not just inappropriate but deeply insensitive. The studio scrambled to figure out what to do with their finished film. They couldn't just release it as planned when the country was in mourning, so they delayed the premiere until June 6, 1986, hoping enough time would pass for audiences to separate fiction from tragedy. It didn't work. Even with the delay, families stayed away from theaters in droves. The film that cost over $18 million to produce earned less than $10 million at the box office domestically, making it one of the biggest financial disasters of the year. Critics were sympathetic to the filmmakers, but noted that audiences simply couldn't enjoy a movie about a space shuttle accident when the real tragedy was still fresh in everyone's minds. The promotional campaign was essentially dead on arrival, with television spots pulled and marketing materials shelved. What should have been a fun summer blockbuster instead became a cautionary tale about how world events can completely destroy even the most carefully planned film release. Fact 2. Production became a 6-month career. When the cast and crew of SpaceCamp signed on to the project, they expected a straightforward 3-month shooting schedule typical of most family adventure films. What they got instead was a grueling 6-month marathon that tested everyone's patience and endurance. The production faced constant delays due to the complexity of filming at an actual NASA facility, technical difficulties with the special effects sequences, and the logistical nightmare of coordinating with the real SpaceCamp operations in Huntsville, Alabama. The young cast members who had expected to spend their summer making a movie and then return to their normal lives found themselves still on set as fall approached and then winter. The extended schedule became such a running joke among the cast and crew that they decided to commemorate their shared suffering with custom t-shirts. The shirts featured slogans that played on the film's title, with some reading, SpaceCamp. It's not just a movie, it's a career, to reflect how the project had consumed half a year of their lives. Others went with the more punny SpaceCramp to express how cramped and confined they felt after months of working in tight shuttle simulator sets and dealing with the physical demands of filming weightlessness scenes. The t-shirts became a bonding symbol for the cast, who years later would recall the extended shoot with a mixture of exhaustion and fondness. Director Harry Weiner later admitted in interviews that the production was far more ambitious than anyone anticipated, and the technical challenges of creating convincing space sequences in 1986 required constant reshoots and adjustments that ate up months of additional time. Fact 3. Only Lea Thompson could handle zero gravity. Creating convincing weightlessness scenes in 1986 required actors to be suspended from cables while performing complex movements that appeared natural and effortless on camera. The production team designed elaborate harness systems that would support the cast members while allowing them freedom of movement, but they quickly discovered that not all actors could handle the physical demands equally. Lea Thompson, who played the determined camp counselor Catherine Fairley, had a significant advantage over her fellow cast members thanks to her background as a trained ballet dancer. Her years of dance training had given her exceptional core strength, body control, and spatial awareness that proved invaluable for the zero-gravity sequences. The harness system used a single cable attached at the hip, which meant actors had to use their abdominal and back muscles to maintain proper positioning and create fluid movements. While other cast members struggled to control their bodies and often looked stiff or awkward when suspended, Thompson moved with grace and naturalness that made her scenes the most believable. The production team realized early on that Thompson's footage was far superior to anyone else's, so they made the decision to feature her weightlessness scenes much more prominently throughout the film. She became essentially the go-to actor whenever the director needed a convincing shot of someone floating through the shuttle interior. Thompson later recalled that the physical demands were exhausting, with each suspended scene requiring multiple takes while she hung from the hip cable, using every ounce of her dancer's strength to make it look effortless. The other cast members would watch her work with a mixture of admiration and relief that they didn't have to perform as many of those challenging sequences. Fact 4. Joaquin Phoenix's awkward feature film debut. Before he became one of Hollywood's most intense and respected actors, Joaquin Phoenix made his feature film debut in SpaceCamp under his childhood stage name, Leaf Phoenix. He was somewhere between 10 and 12 years old during filming, playing the enthusiastic young camper Max who constantly makes references to Star Wars throughout the movie. For young Joaquin, this was his first major role in a theatrical film, and his inexperience showed in ways that critics would later point out in reviews. His character was written to be the comic relief space nerd who idolized Luke Skywalker and dreamed of becoming a Jedi. But Phoenix's delivery of these lines came across as stiff and unnatural. Critics described his performance as wooden, noting that his Star Wars references felt forced rather than spontaneous, and his line readings lacked the energy and enthusiasm that the character required. It's a fascinating piece of cinema history to watch the early work of an actor who would go on to win an Academy Award for Joker and earn nominations for films like Walk the Line, The Master, and Her. The awkwardness of his SpaceCamp performance is completely understandable given his age and inexperience, and it serves as a reminder that even the greatest actors had to start somewhere. Phoenix himself has rarely discussed his time on SpaceCamp in interviews, perhaps because it represents such a different phase of his career compared to the intense dramatic roles he would later become famous for. The film captures a moment before he transitioned from child actor to serious performer, and before he would eventually drop the stage name Leaf and return to using his birth name, Joaquin, for his professional work. Fact 5. Frank Welker voiced both Jinx and the computer. The robot character Jinx, who befriends the young campers and ultimately causes the accidental launch by trying to help, required a distinctive voice that could convey both mechanical precision and emotional warmth. The filmmakers turned to Frank Welker, a legendary voice actor whose career spans decades and includes hundreds of iconic characters. Welker is best known for voicing Fred Jones in the Scooby-Doo franchise since 1969, as well as Megatron in the original Transformers series, but his range extends to virtually every type of character imaginable, from animals to aliens to robots. For SpaceCamp, Welker didn't just voice Jinx, he also performed the voice of the NASA computer system that Jinx interacts with throughout the film. This meant that in several scenes, Welker was essentially having conversations with himself, providing both sides of the dialogue between the friendly robot and the authoritative computer. The decision to use the same voice actor for both roles was partially a practical choice to save on budget and scheduling, but it also created an interesting dynamic, where Jinx's interactions with the computer system had a subtle consistency in tone and delivery. Welker brought his decades of experience to both performances, giving Jinx a slightly higher, more expressive tone while making the computer voice deeper and more monotone to differentiate the characters. His work on SpaceCamp is just a small piece of his massive filmography, but it demonstrates his versatility and his ability to create distinct characters even when voicing multiple roles in the same production. Most viewers watching the film would never realize that the robot and the computer were both performed by the same person. Fact 6. John Williams composed the score. When you think of legendary film composers, John Williams stands at the absolute top of the list with his iconic work on Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Jaws, E.T., and dozens of other classics. So it might come as a surprise that Williams also composed the orchestral score for SpaceCamp, a relatively small family adventure film that has largely been forgotten by mainstream audiences. Williams created an uplifting, soaring orchestral composition that perfectly captured the wonder and excitement of space exploration, with themes that evoked both the danger of the accidental launch and the triumph of the kids successfully returning home. His score was one of the few elements of the film that critics universally praised, noting that Williams brought the same level of craftsmanship and emotional depth to SpaceCamp that he brought to much bigger Hollywood productions. However, the score's release became complicated by the same tragedy that doomed the film itself. When the Challenger disaster occurred just days before the movie's planned premiere, the decision was made to withdraw the soundtrack from the market out of sensitivity to the national mourning. The music that was meant to celebrate space exploration and inspire audiences instead became associated with real-world tragedy, and the studio felt it would be inappropriate to promote and sell the soundtrack while the country grieved. The score was eventually released years later, but the initial withdrawal meant that Williams' work on SpaceCamp never received the attention it deserved during the film's theatrical run. It remains one of his lesser-known compositions, overshadowed both by the film's box office failure and the tragic circumstances surrounding its release, but it showcases his ability to elevate any project with his masterful orchestration. Fact 7. ABC Motion Pictures' final film. SpaceCamp holds a unique and somewhat melancholy place in film history as the last movie ever produced by ABC Motion Pictures before the studio permanently closed its doors. ABC Motion Pictures was the theatrical film production arm of the ABC television network, established to create content that could compete with major Hollywood studios. The company had produced a number of films throughout the 1980s, but by 1985, the studio was struggling financially, and ABC's parent company decided to shut down the theatrical film division. SpaceCamp went into production during this uncertain period, and by the time filming wrapped, ABC Motion Pictures was officially closed in October of 1985. This meant that SpaceCamp became an unintentional swan song for the company, the final product of a studio that no longer existed by the time the film reached theaters. The closure added another layer of difficulty to the film's already troubled release, as there was no studio infrastructure left to properly promote and distribute the movie after the Challenger disaster forced the delayed premiere. Instead, the film was released through 20th Century Fox, but without the full backing and marketing push that it might have received if ABC Motion Pictures had still been operational. The fact that the studio's final film ended up being both a box office disaster and a victim of tragic timing feels almost poetic in a sad way, as if the closure of ABC Motion Pictures and the failure of SpaceCamp were intertwined fates. Today, film historians note SpaceCamp as a footnote in the history of television networks attempting to break into theatrical film production, marking the end of ABC's ambitions in that arena. Fact 8. Geographic impossibility in the plot. SpaceCamp contains a significant geographical inconsistency that most viewers probably never notice unless they're familiar with real NASA facilities and their locations. The film is explicitly set at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where actual space shuttle launches took place, and the characters are clearly meant to be attending camp at that famous location on the Atlantic coast. However, every single scene in the movie was actually filmed at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where the real SpaceCamp program operates. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except that the two locations are approximately 10 hours apart by car, covering nearly 600 miles across multiple states. The film treats these locations as if they're practically next door to each other, with characters making trips between what's supposed to be Kennedy Space Center and various Alabama locations in what appears to be just minutes of screen time. The reason for this geographical confusion comes down to practical filmmaking decisions. The real SpaceCamp in Huntsville had all the simulators, training equipment, and authentic NASA hardware that the filmmakers needed for realistic scenes, while Kennedy Space Center was primarily a launch facility, without the same educational infrastructure. Filming at the Huntsville location gave the production access to actual shuttle simulators and training equipment that would have been impossible to recreate on a Hollywood soundstage with the film's modest budget. So the filmmakers made the choice to shoot everything in Alabama while setting the story in Florida, hoping audiences wouldn't notice or care about the discrepancy. For the most part, they were right, as the average viewer watching the film has no reason to know or think about where SpaceCamp actually operates versus where shuttles actually launch from. Fact 9. Ronald McNair appears as active astronaut. One of the most haunting and tragic details in SpaceCamp appears in a scene where the robot Jinx is shown reviewing NASA computer screens that display lists of active astronauts. If you pause the film and look carefully at those computer displays, you can clearly see the name Ronald McNair listed among the active astronaut roster. McNair was a mission specialist and physicist who had previously flown on Space Shuttle Challenger during mission STS-41B in February of 1984. The SpaceCamp movie was filmed throughout 1985, many months before the Challenger disaster, and during that time McNair was indeed an active astronaut preparing for future missions. So when the prop department created authentic-looking NASA computer displays for the film, they used real current astronaut rosters, which naturally included McNair's name. Then, on January 28, 1986, McNair was aboard Challenger as one of the 7 crew members killed when the shuttle exploded shortly after launch. By the time SpaceCamp reached theaters in June of 1986, that brief shot of McNair's name on the computer screen had transformed from a simple, authentic detail into something much more painful. The filmmakers had no way of knowing that one of the astronauts whose name appeared in their movie would be gone before audiences ever saw it. They couldn't remove the shot without reshooting or extensive editing, and the scene goes by quickly enough that most viewers never notice the name among all the other information on the displays. But for those who do spot it, McNair's presence in the film serves as an eerie reminder of the real tragedy that overshadowed this fictional space adventure. Fact 10. Kate Capshaw met Steven Spielberg before this. Kate Capshaw, who played the lead role of shuttle pilot Andy Bergstrom in SpaceCamp, had recently completed another adventure film that would change her life in ways far beyond her acting career. In 1984, just 2 years before SpaceCamp, Capshaw starred as Willie Scott in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the second film in the Indiana Jones franchise directed by Steven Spielberg. During the production of Temple of Doom, which filmed on location in Sri Lanka and at Elstree Studios in London, Capshaw and Spielberg met and began what would become a long-term relationship. By the time Capshaw was filming SpaceCamp in 1985, she and Spielberg were already a couple, though they kept their relationship relatively private. The two would eventually marry in 1991, 7 years after meeting on the Indiana Jones set, and they remain married today with a large blended family. It's interesting to note that while Temple of Doom was a massive blockbuster hit that solidified Capshaw's Hollywood status, SpaceCamp became a box office disaster that could have damaged her career. However, her relationship with one of the most successful directors in film history certainly didn't hurt her ability to navigate Hollywood despite the failure of SpaceCamp. Capshaw continued acting sporadically throughout the 1990s and 2000s, but she largely stepped back from her career to focus on her family and various philanthropic efforts. Looking back at SpaceCamp now, it represents a snapshot of Capshaw at a particular moment in her life, between meeting her future husband on one adventure film and starring in another ill-fated adventure that, circumstances beyond anyone's control, turned into a commercial failure. Fact 11. Disney Plus remake, announced in 2020. Hollywood's obsession with rebooting and remaking properties from the 1980s eventually reached SpaceCamp, with Disney announcing plans for a new version of the film to be produced exclusively for their Disney Plus streaming service. The announcement came in February of 2020, with the project described as a reimagining of the original story that would update the concept for modern audiences and contemporary space technology. Disney brought on writers Mikey Day and Streeter Seidel, both cast members and writers from Saturday Night Live, to develop the screenplay for the remake. The choice of comedy writers suggested that Disney intended to lean more heavily into the humorous aspects of the premise, possibly taking inspiration from the improvised comedy style that Day and Seidel brought to their SNL work. The announcement generated mixed reactions from fans of the original film, with some excited to see the story introduced to a new generation, while others questioned whether a remake could capture the charm of the 1986 version or whether it would simply become another unnecessary reboot. However, as of late 2025, the project appears to be stuck in development limbo, with little to no progress reported since the initial announcement. There have been no casting announcements, no production start dates, and no updates on the script development. This is fairly typical for Hollywood projects, where many announced films and shows never actually make it to production, but it's still disappointing for those who were genuinely interested in seeing how a modern SpaceCamp might work. The lack of movement suggests that either Disney has decided the project isn't a priority, or the creative team is struggling to find the right approach to updating the story. Fact 12. Cast inducted into SpaceCamp Hall of Fame. Despite the film's commercial failure and tragic timing, SpaceCamp ultimately achieved something far more meaningful than box office success. It inspired countless young people to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In recognition of this lasting impact, the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, which operates the real SpaceCamp program, decided to honor the film and its cast members on the 30th anniversary of the movie's release. In 2016, exactly 30 years after SpaceCamp premiered in theaters, the Space and Rocket Center inducted the entire cast into the SpaceCamp Hall of Fame during a special ceremony. This was a remarkable honor considering the film's box office performance, but it acknowledged something much more important than ticket sales. the movie's ability to spark curiosity and passion for space exploration in children who watched it. The Hall of Fame induction recognized that generations of SpaceCamp attendees over the past 3 decades had been influenced by the film, with many citing it as the reason they first became interested in attending the real camp or pursuing space-related fields. The ceremony brought together cast members who hadn't seen each other in years, allowing them to reflect on how their work on what seemed like a failed project had actually created a meaningful legacy. The U.S. Space and Rocket Center typically reserves Hall of Fame inductions for astronauts, engineers, and others who have made direct contributions to space exploration, so extending this honor to actors from a fictional film demonstrated just how significant SpaceCamp's cultural impact had been over 3 decades. Fact 13. Real Atlantis simulator used for interior shots. One of the reasons SpaceCamp looks and feels more authentic than many other space-themed movies from the 1980s is that the filmmakers had access to genuine NASA training equipment and facilities. The interior shots of the space shuttle, which make up a significant portion of the film's most important sequences, were not filmed on a Hollywood soundstage with sets built from scratch. Instead, the production was granted permission to film inside the actual Space Shuttle Atlantis simulator, located at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. This simulator was used for real astronaut training and education programs at SpaceCamp, giving visitors and trainees the experience of sitting inside a true-to-life replica of a shuttle cockpit and crew compartment. For the filmmakers, having access to this authentic simulator meant that all the switches, panels, displays, and controls visible in the movie were real NASA equipment rather than props created by the art department. The actors could interact with actual shuttle hardware, and the cramped, complex environment of the simulator naturally came through on screen without requiring any artificial enhancement. This level of authenticity was extremely rare for movies in the 1980s, when most science fiction and space films relied entirely on built sets that approximated what filmmakers imagined space vehicles might look like. The decision to film at the real SpaceCamp also created challenges, as the production had to work around the facility's regular schedule of camp sessions and educational programs. They couldn't simply take over the simulator for weeks at a time, but instead had to coordinate their shooting schedule with the ongoing operations of the camp. Despite these logistical complications, the authenticity that came from using real NASA training equipment was invaluable. Fact 14. Both Film and Challenger had solid rocket booster malfunctions. Beyond the simple timing of the Challenger disaster occurring just before SpaceCamp's planned release, there was a deeply unsettling specific parallel between the real tragedy and the fictional plot that made the film even more difficult for audiences to watch. In SpaceCamp, the accidental launch happens when there's a malfunction with one of the solid rocket boosters attached to the shuttle, creating a dangerous situation that the characters must overcome to safely return to Earth. The movie presents this as a thrilling adventure scenario where quick thinking and teamwork save the day. In reality, the Challenger disaster was caused by a failure of an O-ring seal in one of the solid rocket boosters, which allowed hot gas to escape and ultimately led to the structural failure and explosion of the entire vehicle. The fact that both the fictional accident in SpaceCamp and the real Challenger disaster involved problems with solid rocket boosters created an eerie coincidence that was not lost on anyone involved with the film or the audiences who eventually saw it. This parallel made the movie feel less like innocent entertainment and more like an unwitting prediction of tragedy, even though the filmmakers had no way of knowing that real-world events would so closely mirror their fictional plot. It transformed what was meant to be an exciting action sequence into something uncomfortable and potentially distressing for viewers who remembered watching the actual Challenger explosion on television. The studio considered whether it would be possible or appropriate to re-edit the film to change the cause of the fictional accident, but doing so would have required extensive reshoots and might have created new plot problems. Fact 15. Leah Thompson says film inspired real scientists. More than 2 decades after SpaceCamp disappeared from theaters as a box office failure, Leah Thompson began hearing stories that completely changed how she viewed her work on the film. In interviews given around 2012, Thompson revealed that over the years since the movie's release, numerous people had approached her or reached out to tell her that SpaceCamp was the reason they pursued careers in science, technology, engineering, or invention. These weren't just casual fans saying they enjoyed the movie, but actual physicists, engineers, NASA employees, and inventors who credited the film with sparking their childhood interest in space and science. Thompson found this incredibly moving, especially given that the movie had been considered such a commercial disaster when it first came out. She realized that while SpaceCamp may have failed to make money in theaters during the summer of 1986, it had found a second life on home video, cable television, and eventually streaming platforms, where new generations of children discovered it and were inspired by the story of young people participating in a space adventure. The film's message about ordinary kids accomplishing extraordinary things through knowledge, teamwork, and determination resonated with viewers who went on to make that fiction a reality in their own lives. Thompson expressed particular pride in knowing that the movie had encouraged young women to pursue careers in fields that were often male-dominated, as her character Catherine showed girls that they could be competent, intelligent leaders in technical fields. This long-term cultural impact represents a kind of success that box office numbers could never measure, transforming SpaceCamp from a cautionary tale about bad timing into an inspirational story about how art can influence lives in unexpected ways.